surprisingly to many people today, it was the most popular attraction in the entire World's Fair.
Wow.
The single most popular attraction at an American World's Fair at the end of the 19th century was an Indonesian village. And it was a sensation. It was the cover of every major magazine. Newspapers sent reporters just to cover it. And they became the part of the foundational collection of the big Natural History Museum here.
Inilah Endgame. Halo teman-teman, saya seringkali ditanya di sosmed. Saya ingin ikut berkontribusi untuk Indonesia yang lebih keren di 2045. Baiknya mulai dari mana? Mungkin salah satu saran saya yaitu belajar public policy.
Nah, itulah pentingnya public policy.
To change is definitely also policies, right?
Dan untuk mendeliver itu, tadi butuh teknologi, butuh uang, dan butuh policy.
Nah, pemahaman terhadap analisis kebijakan itu memungkinkan kita untuk mengaktualisasikan solusi untuk berbagai permasalahan, apalagi yang sifatnya struktural. Tidak hanya di pemerintahan, tapi juga di dunia usaha maupun non-profit. Mantan Sekjen PBB Ban Ki-moon, Perdana Menteri Singapura Lee Hsien Loong, dan jurnalis Rachel Maddow, semuanya adalah lulusan jurusan Public Policy. SKPP Indonesia, sekolah public policy pertama di Indonesia dengan bahasa pengantar bahasa Inggris, sedang membuka penerimaan mahasiswa untuk batch terbaru. Untuk detail mengenai program dan cara mendaftar, atau sekedar berkonsultasi mengenai rencana karir teman-teman ke depan, hubungi SKPP Indonesia melalui link yang ada di deskripsi. Now back to the show. Halo teman-teman, hari ini kita kedatangan Ted Fishman, teman dekat saya dan penulis yang sangat terkenal dari Chicago, Amerika Serikat. Hi Ted, how are you?
Hi, good. Selamat malam.
Selamat malam, selamat pagi.
Terima kasih atas kesempatan ini. Pak Gita, saya mau melanjutkan dalam bahasa Indonesia, dalam bahasa Inggris, tapi ya, saya mau bilang dulu terima kasih sekali atas kehormatan ini ikut podcast Pak Gita yang panjang.
That was really good. Thank you. And I wanna peel the onion by asking you about your background. You spent your early childhood in the U.S. and then you went to university in the U.S. and for some reason you got hooked up with Yogyakarta, and then you got famous. Tell us the story. I mean, you've written 2 best-selling books, The Shock of Grey and China Inc. We'll talk about these, but please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, you're right. I grew up in outside Chicago in a suburb. My parents were both city kids. Their parents immigrated from Central Europe to the United States early in the 20th century, escaping persecution, which is the story of a lot of people in Chicago. And they were the first in their family, they were the first generation in their family to go to college, which is an American story. And it's very close to a lot of Indonesian stories.
Right.
And I went to a huge suburban high school that had a lot of activities there. And one of the things that I did in high school was I was on the debate team. And the debate team, you would spend a whole year researching one question and arguing both sides of that question. And I was a very successful debater. I was a national champion debater.
My.
And, one of the things that I learned doing debate is, I almost tried to find ways to lose debates, but I seem to never lose.
I'll never debate you.
So anyway, it kind of left me jaded, Gita, because I thought, oh my God, if you bring enough research and intelligence to any question, any side of a question, you could make the case. And it made me feel like, wow, it's really more important to change your mind. It's just as important to be able to change your mind as to argue your case. Which is why, for a long time I thought of being a lawyer, but then I thought being a writer is a little more interesting because you can look at all sides. You don't have to dig in just on one side. And the miracle of an open mind is underappreciated.
Right.
I think a lot of times people get their gut instinct and then they argue that. And my experience in high school, and then I debated at Princeton too, was that you really have to be careful about your own intelligence, because you could apply your own intelligence really intensely on a question and convince yourself of something that's not true.
That's scary.
Anyway, this has kind of been a guiding principle in my life now, which is just to really work hard to keep my mind open, to listen, and so on. So I think that's one of the things that drives me towards other countries and other cultures and other points of view, is I'm really hungry for this chance to change my mind about something.
What did you study at Princeton?
I studied philosophy.
Okay.
Philosophy in those days, which was in the 1970s in American and English universities, was not necessarily the big questions about life. It was more kind of closer to math and logic. But I wrote my thesis on a topic that was really personal for me, which was, what is a person over time? Why do we think of ourselves as somebody who is important to plan for, even though we know at age 20, we might despise ourselves at age 70? That all our opinions are going to change, that the facts of our lives are going to change. You might start your youth as a communist and end up as a right winger. You never know. And this topic was interesting for me because I'm an identical twin, and I have a biological clone of myself out there in the world who has almost everything in common with me at that moment. So why would I save for myself at age 70 instead of giving what I have in my life to the person who's just like me now? I never really found a good answer to that. It's still true. I still have this clone in the world, and I have to live with looking at a version of myself all the time like that.
I've met with your clone a couple of times.
He's a wonderful person.
Yeah.
And so anyway, when I went to college, I went to Princeton. I didn't expect to go to Princeton, but a friend of mine was there and she sent me the application. She said, I think you'd like it here. So I applied at the very last minute, got in, and it was a really lucky choice. And I was lucky to go there because there were so many opportunities to explore the world beyond the United States from Princeton. So when I was between my first and second year at Princeton, I spent 4 months in Japan working in factories for the Panasonic company.
Wow.
And living in a worker's dormitory, and really got a taste for a very foreign experience for me. Not only was it a worker's experience, it was an industrial experience, it was a foreign experience, the food was all different, but I also learned another way of being a host and being a friend. And people were so kind to me. I had a funny thing happen to me on my first day. I thought, I'm kind of short. I'm kind of short for Americans. And I thought, finally, I'm going to Japan where I'm going to be tall. And I was so excited, to finally not be, the small guy in the room. And then I get to the dormitory where they're putting me. And, in Japan, everybody takes their shoes off like they do in Indonesia before you enter a house. And I looked at the shoe rack at the door, and there were all these gigantic shoes, like twice the size of my shoes. And I thought, what is going on here? I'm not going to be the tall guy here. It turns out my dormitory in Japan, they have these corporate basketball leagues, which are at the time were like their big leagues. And I was in the dorm with the national championship basketball team of Japan. And so not only was I small, I was smaller than usual. And, so they were all still at work at the time. So I went and I took a bath in their searingly hot bath. It took me about a half hour to get up to my knees in the hot water. And then these giants come into the bathroom, jump right in, and the hot water spills over my head. And, you know, I'm in the water up to here. They're up in the water up to their belly button. So anyway, you know, talk about, you know, changing your expectations in a new place. You know, you really can't come in with expectations. You have to be open.
Interesting.
And that experience for me working in Japan was still in the era where people were moving from the farm to the city to work in factories.
Right.
So I worked in a factory. One of the factories I worked in was a battery factory. And I worked with a lot of girls who were like 16 or 17, which you don't see in the United States. You don't see girls that young doing factory work. And their story was all the same. You know, their parents were farmers. They moved to the city. They lived in dormitories. And every morning I would get up before work. I would get dressed in the company uniform. I would go to the factory. I would sing the company song. I would see the regimentation in the workplace, but I would also see how Japanese industry was so tightly connected to the national project of the country. And this became a really important point of view for me later when I did research on China.
See.
Because that was a stage that China went through later, you know, 20, 30 years later. But I got to see it in that early formative stage. And I got a taste for Asian media. In my dormitory, there were giant stacks of these manga comic books that grown men were reading. And it was interesting to me to see how many comic books grown men read in Japan. But, you know, I enjoyed them too. And then eventually I moved over to movies. And then at Princeton, there was a movie society and they had all the classic Japanese movies. But if you went to New York City on the weekend, you could go to these really filthy, divey, cheap movie theaters in Times Square where they would have 3 or 4 kung fu movies in a row. So I would escape my studies, go to New York, watch kung fu movies. And I thought, I really have to get back to Asia some way or other.
Which you did.
Which I did. So Princeton has a program called Princeton in Asia, where they send volunteers all throughout Asia at the time. And they had a good relationship with Indonesia then. And I applied for a lot of fellowships. After graduating, I could have gone to Norway, which interested me because I had a professor from Norway.
Right.
I could have gone to Taiwan, and I thought, why would I ever go to Taiwan? I had been to Taiwan in 1978, and it was a dictatorship. It was very polluted. There was no way to go to China. And I thought to myself, why would I go to Taiwan? There, you can't even go to China. What would my future be like if I learned Chinese? You can't go to China. It's probably the stupidest decision I ever made from a practical point of view. And then, but I was offered this position in Indonesia, and I didn't know anything about Indonesia. But there are a couple very famous anthropologists at Princeton, Clifford Geertz and Hildy Geertz, who are probably at the time did the most famous work on Indonesia. So I ran to the office of Hildy Geertz and I said, should I go to Indonesia? And she said, you'd be stupid not to. It's a wonderful country. You'll have fun exploring it. The language is good. There's no tones. There's no levels. It's a Roman alphabet. And the people are great.
This was
I signed
in
up
1980,
Princeton,
right?
1980.
Right.
Princeton paid for me to take a 10-week courses kilat at Berkeley in Indonesian, and I did that. And I met a good friend of mine, Nathan, who will come into the story in a minute. And I was always a terrible language student. In fact, at Princeton, I had to get special permission to skip the language requirement because I was such a terrible language student. But I really wanted to learn a language, and I had the chance to be in Indonesia for 2 or 3 years, and I thought I could probably have a good chance of learning Indonesian. So after 10 weeks of the most intensive Indonesian language study, when I arrived in Jakarta, I could say 2 words, ke hotel. So I ended up in the hotel, finally went to finally went to Jogja and met my the other volunteers who were going to be teaching at Gajah Mada University. Gajah Mada had a center, may still have a center called CEL2, which was, it was the center to teach professors who were going to study abroad on fellowships, mostly in the United States, some in Europe. So my students at Gajah Mada were professors, which was, I felt like I was a kid in a candy store because I could ask these professors anything. I was free to humiliate them with difficult questions. But we had so much fun. I had so much fun with them, and they were so generous with me. And Jogja was such a great city to be in.
Still is.
Still is. And I in my whole time there, in that first 2.5 years, I really was only in Jakarta for a few days. I spent almost all my time either in Jogja or traveling to more, interesting tourist places. Sumatra, Bali, Lombok, Sulawesi. And I didn't know anything about the world of politics or governance or anything, but I definitely was a child of the new order in Indonesia. The kinds of things people talked about, the newspapers that were blacked out, getting Tempo magazine with the cover all inked out, seeing the kind of coverage, and also, the development philosophy.
Right.
Which was also very informative to me later when I worked on China. For me, there were always these areas of conversation that stopped in that period because people just didn't want to talk about them too much, even with my professor friends. But not as closed as you would imagine in a state run by a strong leader like Suharto. But still, the media was closed down. And then I remember there was 1 or 2 weeks where you could get the Pramudia books where they were allowed to be published, and everybody was rushing to get them. And that was that to me was a window. It's okay, if this thing is available just now and everybody's so hungry for it, what else are they hungry for? They must be hungry for so much more. And then 2 weeks later, they stopped publishing the books. It was a fluke. But my friends got them. And I read, Bumi Manusia and with a dictionary. And, to me, it was there's a lot of genius in this country which is being suppressed, creative genius in this country which is being suppressed. And my exposure to Indonesian culture then was really mostly of traditional Indonesian culture or street culture, And I would say, for me, some of the most important lessons I learned from my time in Jogja were learning all the ingredients in Indonesian food so I could make it when I got home. I lived outside Gajah Mada in a desa. So really learning about desa life was so fascinating for me. I lived in a small bamboo house. It didn't have electricity. My neighbors all urged me. They said, Ted, you're a Londo. You need electricity. You should get electricity. They urged me to get a single socket in my ceiling for a light bulb. I agreed to that. I didn't need it, but I agreed to it because they wanted me to have it. And then when I came home, there were extension cords to all of their houses. A small service I could provide. But I lived right across the street from a famous warung that served pecel, which is still my favorite food in the world. And all the jajanan there. And that became one of the places where I really learned to be a better person and a better friend to people, because in the desa, it's so social and it's so multi-generational, and you really get involved in the lives of other people. And my neighbors were so generous with me and bringing me into their homes and allowing me to get to know their children. And I would say that's a lesson that just serves me every day of my life, which is, there's a lot of viruses in the world that make the world worse, that make the world sicker.
Right.
But in Indonesia, the friendship is the virus.
Yeah.
If you have a friend, you have 10 friends.
Yeah.
Because they're going to Indonesians bring you into their world.
And they mutate in a good way.
And they mutate in the best way. Just as an aside, there's a big American holiday, Thanksgiving, which I love. And we used to have a Thanksgiving in Jogja, and I would invite some friends. But these days, I like to have a kind of Thanksgiving for Indonesians in the Chicago area, Indonesian students. So this year, because of COVID, it was a little hard to round people up. People didn't know whether they could come, whether they'd be real comfortable in a crowd or anything. And this was the day after Thanksgiving. I had bought turkeys and I had all of the different side dishes and everything. And I had responses from about 12 people a couple days before Thanksgiving. And I thought, oh man, this is going to be so quiet. It's going to be, and then as the day gets closer, I keep getting these emails and WhatsApp messages. Is that Thanksgiving still happening, Pat Ted? If so, I would like to bring a few friends. And I thought, so I said to my wife, Sarah, who knows this, I said, this party's growing. It's an Indonesian party. I wouldn't be surprised if there were 35 people who came. I better get an extra turkey. So I went and I got an extra turkey. And then Thanksgiving came and I keep getting these messages. Then the morning of, there's I get this list. I'm bringing these people. There's 12 people on the list. And so that night, 50 people were in my house.
Oh my.
And it was so much fun. For me, it's like being on drugs, it's just that social world with Indonesians, and I think one reason I really love learning Indonesian and learning Indonesian language with Indonesians is that there's so much wordplay, there's so much fun with language. There's so many puns.
Yeah.
And a lot of the puns come from other languages, local dialects, from English, from Dutch, whatever. And there's so much fun within. And that's a kind of American thing, because we're this big melting pot. The language play often pulls in, this has this multicultural aspect.
Right.
And it's just a fun way to be with your friends. But then there's also the loyalty of Indonesian friends. I'm still friends with the people I knew in Jogja, many of them. I was stupid enough to lose contact with some of them, and some of them have since died. And I feel so terrible about that I've really promised myself that I don't want that to happen. But when I go back to Indonesia today, we still travel together. We see each other. I know their families, their kids. Their kids come here to school sometimes, and then I get a whole new generation of friendship from them. And I don't know, I would just say my life is so much richer because of my experience in Indonesia. My wife calls Indonesia my mistress because I think about it every day. And, I'm in conversation with Indonesians every day. Really, I am.
That's very heartening.
If you look at my Facebook or WhatsApp feed, it's, 80% Indonesians.
Some of those are from me.
Yeah, I love that too.
Wow. And
anyway, then after Princeton, after Princeton in Indonesia, I was very sick. I got really sick in West Sumatra, and then I went home. I was hospitalized for a long time, and then I left the hospital and I went to New York to reconnect with my college friends. I started reconnecting with my college friends. And as it happened, Paquita, I was hired as a researcher at a law firm where one of the lawyers helped craft the Indonesian constitution. His name was Robert Hornet. And he had a deep knowledge of the country. And there were Indonesian lawyers in the firm. And also the public relations firm that did public relations for the New Order regime was in the same building, producing all of these information sheets, which were basically propaganda for the Suharto regime. And so there was a kind of circle of Indonesians that I had in New York. And this law firm was also suing the Indonesian government at the time because the military had expropriated a hotel of a Hong Kong investor. And all of these big, scary New Order generals were commanded to come to New York to testify in front of this tribunal that was hearing the case. So here's me, little Ted Fishman, you know, teacher in Jogja, you know, jumped off my Indonesian bicycle into this important legal case being heard before the tribunal of the World Court, of the World Bank, sorry. And getting to interview and help interview all of these really terrifying New Order generals. And that was actually a side of Indonesia I hadn't seen, which was kind of the deep corruption of the Suharto regime. It was a revelation to me, but it was easier to see outside the country for me than inside the country, although Indonesians, of course, lived with it. So, you know, I was going to go to law school, but then I changed my mind about that. And I thought, well, what's a career that I would really like based on my Indonesian experience, my kind of love of being independent? You know, being in Indonesia really made me lose my taste for graduate school because I didn't really feel like going back and being a student after being on my own with so much freedom there. So in Chicago at the time, there were the new derivatives markets, the options markets.
Right.
And my brother was trading on those. And he said, well, you should come trade with me. And this doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, you know, Chicago was the poster child for the worst side of capitalism because you could get these pictures of these trading floors where everybody was in colorful jackets screaming their heads off at each other. And I said, well, why would I ever do that job? You know, you're buying and selling things you never see. You have no customers. You have no inventory. You know, all that's in it is money. And my brother said, well, that's why you do it. So I did that job. And for 12 years, I had my own derivatives trading firm. And you would be surprised how close it was working on that big center poster boy for capitalism as it was bargaining for batik in the stalls of Pasar Beringharjo. You know, I had learned by bargaining with the best, you know, the ladies of Beringharjo. And I liked the job for a long time. I went spectacularly broke a couple times. I came back. But once I had a family, I didn't like the idea that I might go broke again. Yeah. You know, it's a job with enormous amount of risk. You can lose many times what you have. And I had been writing all along. I'd been writing for magazines all along, and I really have always loved writing. I was in a writing program in college with a famous writer named Joyce Carol Oates. For most of my time at Princeton, and I had been writing for newspapers and magazines in the hours when I wasn't trading. So I thought, well, I'll stop trading and I'll try and go for a national career as a writer. And I was old enough then so that my friends who were writers in college were now editors and they could hire me. So I turned to them and they gave me work, and it turned out, and I started working for some really great magazines. I think
big names.
Big name. I've written, like, in the English language world, I've written for virtually every important magazine.
Oh yeah. Mention the names.
Let's see, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, so many magazines that are now broke. I think I must curse them because when I write for them, they go out of business. But all of these giant magazines,
well, not
Money,
the New York
Smart
Times.
Worth, yeah, New York Times is still around.
And they're going to be around for a long time.
Yeah, I was one of the marquee writers at Harper's Magazine for a long time.
Right.
And I've written for The Atlantic. I've written for National Geographic, for the German magazine Geo or Geo. I even had a piece in Tempo once. And
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, and Tempo ran a big feature on me later too, which was very nice. Okay. And I don't know, so many. I've just cleaned out my office. It took me 6 weeks to clean out 40 years of work, and I have, I don't know, thousands and thousands of articles here.
Wow.
And then I also reviewed theater, and I reviewed art, and I reviewed museum shows and everything. It's if you're a person who likes to learn, writing is a really wonderful profession, and I love to learn. And you also get to talk to people. You have license to talk to people that your readers want to talk to, but you get to talk to them.
What made you start thinking of writing a book?
I wasn't thinking of writing a book. I love magazines. Magazines to me are the ideal format. Unfortunately, they're kind of going away, but I love the periodic nature of them, the timeliness of them. I love the energy in the writing, and I get a lot of magazines. I get like 5 or 6 magazines a day. It's almost like I inject them. I just read them all the time. So I love the magazine form, but my favorite editor at the time at Harper's Magazine, we did some really good and influential work there, got a job at a book publisher, and he called me. He said, "Ted, you're a book author now."
Wow. What year was this?
This was
The 90s, right?
No, I think that was around 2002.
Okay. I thought it was in the late 90s. Okay. All right.
Yeah, 2002 where he did that. And so I wanted to do a book on the world's 5 biggest businesses, which are also the world's 5 most violent and corrupt businesses. It was such an ambitious thing. And I had written about a lot of that for Harper's Magazine. It's going to be the sex trade, the arms trade, the drugs trade, and petroleum and other minerals. And then he said, "Well, I've done a lot with that with you already. Ted, I know you're interested in Asia and China. Would you think about writing a book on China?" In the early 2000s, China really wasn't news in the United States. It was like maybe back pages of the newspaper, business page news. But I was interested in it. I didn't have the expertise to do it, Pagita. I just didn't.
Call me Gita.
Gita. And so I was nervous about it. So I said, what if I did a book about how the changes in China are going to change the rest of the world? That way I don't have to be such an expert on China, but I am more comfortable speaking about globalization in a more broad sense. And I thought I could use my experience in Japan and Indonesia as the cornerstone for that investigation. Because when I was working in Japan in the 70s, to my surprise, my boss at Matsushita, which was Panasonic, said, "Ted, you're from America. All of us wake up every morning with America on our mind. We open the newspaper and there's America. We listen to the radio and there's America. But Japan has been in China's shadow for a long time. And eventually China is going to be a bigger deal for you than it is now." And that observation never left me. And I had been tracking with that observation for decades. And then when I got to Indonesia, it was at a time where you couldn't buy any products from China in the United States. There was no imported products from China in the United States. If it was Chinese, it came from Taiwan. I had never seen a Chinese thing, maybe some souvenirs from Chinatown, but they weren't even from China, mainland China. And I had been to Hong Kong, of course, so I knew that. But when I got to Indonesia, the first thing I bought was a thermos to keep my hot water for tea in. It was from China. It cost nothing. I mean, to me, it cost the same price as a bag of chips. And then my second week in Jogja, I thought, I can't be walking everywhere. I'm going to go get a bicycle. So I went and got a Phoenix bicycle, which was a knockoff of a Dutch bicycle.
Made in China.
But from China. And it cost, in American dollars, it cost $12. New. And I had bought a bicycle in college, a cheap bicycle for $200. And so I thought, when is this amazing world of cheap manufacturing goods going to arrive in the United States? It's going to change the country. And so when I was asked to do a book on China, I thought, well, this is starting to unfold. And it's going to be powerful. So I did write China Inc. It was the first book in English anyway to identify China as an emerging superpower.
This came out in 2002 or 3?
No, it came out at the end of 2005.
5.
I got the contract right when SARS was happening, speaking of pandemic.
2002, 3, yeah.
Yeah, 2002, 3. And, SARS was terrible, but it was great for me because it meant that every other book that anybody was writing on China was canceled.
Well, that was just a year after China entered the WTO in 2001, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And everybody saw that as a huge sea change.
Yeah.
I mean, you know more about how that unfolded and whether anybody got what they wanted out of it.
Right.
So nobody was going to China. And I called my editor. I said, look, SARS, I don't know if I can do this. He said, just do it. Just do it. So I went to Washington, and there's enormous expertise on China in Washington. And then as soon as China opened up, I went to China. And then I would identify some trend in China. This is kind of the way a writer like me works. You identify some trend and it kind of makes lights go off, and then you think, well, maybe I should follow that. So I'd identify some trend. Maybe a German company was in China ahead of American companies or whatever. So then I would go to Germany and follow the trend there and talk to people in Germany about China. Or then I would go back to China, report some more. I saw something in Japan, and then I would go to Japan and talk about that. Or something in the US. So I kept bouncing in and out of China, kind of drawing the lines from China to the rest of the world. And when the book came out, there were no other big books on China. I was lucky. I kind of filled the gap.
It was a great book too.
Thank you. So the book took off.
Yeah.
And
became a bestseller.
And what happened? It became a giant global bestseller.
Yeah.
In every market in the world. And there's no way to predict that. Nobody knows what makes a book a success, but that one became a success. And what happens when you write a book is that when you're reporting the book, everybody kind of gives you their story, right. The best version of their story. We had these goals. Our business was to do this. We really tried. We did it, and now we're succeeding. And this is our story for investors. But when you write the book, and it's out there and people have read it, then they start telling you their problems because you're the expert and you've already written the book. So there's no danger. So oddly, after I wrote the book, I learned so much more about the world of international trade, manufacturing, strategy. I was brought into Pentagon stuff, like every realm of international relations and trade somehow pulled me in to talk about it. So, I got really interested in that stuff. And one of the things that just kept coming back to me over and over again was, what is the big change in China that's changing the world? Well, the big change in China is that a few 100 million people have left the farm and have gone to the cities to work in these factories, replaying what happened when I was in Japan. Where you had these farmers who carried rice sacks all of a sudden on heavy machinery. And that was the story of China. And they were building their cities. They were building their factories. The girls were working in the factories. The men were working in heavy industry. And what happened, and China had the one-child policy, of course.
Right.
So while this huge change in China was happening, I saw two things. I saw the rest of the world buying the labor of young Chinese people. China's 16 to 22-year-olds were on sale to the rest of the world to work at astonishingly low wages, far lower than the average wage in Indonesia at the time.
Yeah.
And there was an seemingly endless supply of them. And China had a one-child policy so that young parents didn't have big families they had to support. They only had one kid. The workers in the factories, their parents were still young, so they didn't have to support their parents because their parents were still farming or doing whatever. And, this is the demographic dividend that people talk a lot about in Indonesia, but Indonesia doesn't have a one-child policy, thank God.
Yeah.
And I thought there's this giant arbitrage going on in the world where the aging labor forces from Europe and America and Japan are being abandoned for the young labor force in China. And because capitalism doesn't want to pay for the cost of aging societies, but they will pay for unburdened young workers who work for almost nothing.
Yeah.
And
Ironically.
so that was the new argument in the next book I wrote, which is Shock of Gray, that there's this giant global age arbitrage that's going on. And in order for that to be effective, China had to create this kind of age apartheid where it ruthlessly separated the young from the old in the country.
Yeah.
So you would go to villages in the countryside, there'd be no young people there left. You would go to the cities and they would be so much younger than any place in the United States or Europe. That's changing over time, and China's worried about it. There's opportunity for Indonesia there. And so, that book also had a big international audience, and it was published twice in China, Geeta. It was published shortly after it came out by a government publisher that did a really boring kind of academic translation.
China
But there was
Inc. or
another
Shock of
publisher.
Gray?
This is called Shock of Gray.
Yeah. Okay, the second book. Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah. But then there was another publisher in China that had wanted the book to publish in China, but didn't get it. So when the other company didn't do well with the book, they were wondering, could we buy it and do it again? And so they did, like several years later, like 3 years ago in 2018, I think. They published it again with another title just called Old and Poor, which is which is a great title. Wish I had that title. And they translated it in a much more lively way. And it became a sensation in China. It became a bestseller. I did a huge book tour, like way after I thought the book was dead. But the issue is still so much alive there. And I would go to these events in China and there'd be hundreds of people at these talks that I gave, who afterwards would just come and plead like, Mr. Fishman, what do we do? How can we do this? I can't stand it. I've got my older parents. I've got my, the prices of apartments in Beijing are so high, but if I don't have one, I can't get married and blah, blah, blah. And they were so desperate. Of course, I don't have good answers for them, but after you write the book, people bring you their problems.
Oh, man.
And so, that's kind of, just kind of pulling this all together. It's the way these big issues connect in ways that are kind of out of the silos of academic disciplines. You could think across disciplines if you go to different places, talk to lots of people. I have the luxury of talking to hundreds of people all the time, seeing things from new ways. These themes can emerge in your thinking that seem worth pursuing and can be interesting.
Halo teman-teman, terima kasih sudah menjadi teman setia Endgame. Cek rilis terbaru dari Future Narrators Merchandise Collection dan dukung terus misi kami untuk mencari ide-ide terbaik dari narator-narator keren lainnya. Link pemesanan ada di deskripsi. Now back to the show. Ted, you've written so many, articles and 2 best-selling books. Talk a little bit about the process of writing a book, right? And I think this could be inspirational for young Indonesians who have the aspiration to write a book on the recognition that I think Asians in general, they have lacked the ability relative to the Europeans and Americans in documenting things, right? Yeah. And I think the Asians are waking up to this notion that it's time, it's high time for us to start documenting things a little bit more diligently, more meticulously. And I do see a future where I think we're going to see a rise in a number of Indonesians getting involved in book writing. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
First of all, I just want to open this discussion by saying that Indonesia is a great place to think about writing, because it is a place where a lot of forces come together that work on you as a person, work on your community, work on a country. And there's no shortage of themes. And in the world of books, there's so many ways to approach your own story. You can approach it in the most personal way. You can approach it from 40,000 miles in the air. Any way that interests you, there's a way to make a book out of it. And for me, the one thing I always advise people who are thinking of writing a book is you should write the kind of book that you want to read.
Yeah.
Don't, if you think that books are written in a very kind of rare academic voice, that where you have to write like the world's smartest person, you're wrong. You really just have to write in a way that's true to yourself.
Yeah.
At the top of your own intelligence. You don't have to be at the top of someone else's intelligence who's beyond you. Your intelligence is enough. And when you do a book, you find the top of your intelligence. That's the drug of doing a book, is that you are so deep in the topic that you are making connections you never dreamed your imagination or intelligence was capable of making, because you're so deep in it and it's your own passion. For me, a book starts with a question. Something, and I like the kinds of questions that allow you to bring in lots of different topics. So this China topic, that allowed me to talk about people all over the world. The aging topic, who isn't affected by aging? What issue in society isn't somehow connected with aging? I could attack it from so many different directions. So if you read my book about aging, you're really reading a book about the world. But it's your world. It's the world you walk in. It's your living room. It's your kitchen. It's your workplace. It's your community. I like that kind of book. But other people will write about really fascinating book about their disease. It's not a global book at all. It's intensely personal, but it's also very moving. But that's the kind of book they want to read and that they feel compelled to write. My own process is to do an insane amount, an unreasonable amount of research, because I like research too much. And so I do a lot of research first, and then I kind of like sit down and have, don't sleep for 4 months and write the book.
How do you go about researching? What's the first preliminary step that one ought to take?
You just never know, Gita. Like when I was starting the China book with SARS, and I couldn't go to China, I did the first thing that all really serious investigative journalists do when they're in this situation. I called my mother. And she said, "Oh, you should talk to the Cedar family down the street. I think they have something to do with China." So I called the Cedar family. I went to school with one of them. I said, "I hear you guys do something with China." He goes, "Yeah." And then I was off and running. Once he started talking, I thought, "Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
Wow.
I'm going to follow that." And, sometimes it's just talking to your neighbor or anybody. And
is it
my
typically
reporting
within
almost always begins with people. What?
Is it typically within 3, 4, 5 degrees of freedom before you hit it off?
Yeah, or even more, sometimes even more. Sometimes it's just like, "Oh, you went to Princeton too," or whatever, or something like that. Or, yeah. I do try and find that connection. I love making connections, and it helps getting the conversation going. And then, listening is the number one skill. And then there's real research to do, documentary research, statistical research, and so on. And because I'm not an expert in any of these techniques, even once I have that kind of research, then I end up having to talk to somebody about it too.
Is there an episode where you get a little too immersed? I mean, in acting, you know, the actor gets to be in character a little too much.
That happens to me all the time.
Really? And to
Yeah,
the point
sometimes
it
I know
affects
so
your...
much about a topic, or I'm so interested in a topic that I can't bring it into a structure that makes sense for a reader. And
Wow.
sometimes the things that I'm most interested in kind of collapse as projects because I've overwhelmed myself. You know, it's like this. I actually wrote it in China. It's like this cliche that people say about China. It's like, if you're going to write a book about China, you better do it fast because pretty soon you'll know too much to write the book. You know, and that's happened to me on a couple big projects that I'm on. I just ended up knowing so much about it that I kind of felt I was at sea. I couldn't bring the material back into a structure. Editors can help with that. A good editor. For me, my editors are really important to me. And I think they know that working with me is also real work, that they have to help me with that. But, you know, that's also the magic of this job, which is that you can go get that deeply immersed in a topic.
Yeah. What about your lifestyle? Does that get affected by your work? Does that change
your
you?
lifestyle, it's basically you're on final exams your whole life. Wow. You know, you're in final exam week your whole life.
That's crazy.
You know, I write short form things too. So I also review theater still. So I go to the theater 2 or 3 times a week. And those I just have to write those that night. And I really like it because I can't think about it that much. But it's a way to just write. And, you know, I don't have to be the world's expert on that show. I just have to tell a reader what they want to know in order to have a better experience seeing it.
Ted, I know you're working on something big at the moment. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This also has its origins in Indonesia, Gita. When I was young in Indonesia, I was really fascinated by the Suharto's regime's connection with the cement and concrete businesses. And I was also really fascinated, like, how did the government run without much tax revenue? You know, Indonesia was still an OPEC country then, so it had the oil revenue.
Right.
You know, I kept hearing over and over again about Suharto's very close connection to the concrete and cement industry. And I was wondering, like, why is he so connected to that? As a young person, I couldn't put it together exactly. But because Indonesia was receiving a lot of international aid and loans for the infrastructure sector and for development projects, that was a sector in which there was money that was available. And so, you know, there's been a lot written about that and about that connection. But, you know, every construction project is a unique project. So they're uniquely structured to extract money out of them that you shouldn't be taking. You know, so there's a lot of ways for regimes to enrich themselves in the infrastructure sector. And if you look at any dictatorship around the world, and it's true in democracies too, but any dictatorship especially, one of the coziest relationships is with the material sector, the companies that are, you know, creating building materials. In Indonesia, often that was cement and concrete. So I mentioned this to a friend of mine years later, who does a political scientist who works on Indonesia, and he says, you could write a great book about concrete.
Okay.
And I thought, so I started thinking about concrete. And then when I did Shock of Gray, I was really interested in what doubled the human lifespan over the last 100 years. And it turns out that what doubles the human lifespan over the 100 years more than anything else is effective public health. And effective public health is mostly due to the use of concrete because it delivers people clean water. It prevents people from getting insect-borne diseases. And I was thinking, wow, there isn't a realm in life that isn't touched by this material concrete, the political realm, the social realm, the defense realm. And it's a huge wealth creator, regime supporter, whatever. So I started poking into doing work on this topic. And it's the kind of topic I love because it's a global topic. It touches a lot of different themes.
Right.
I get to learn a little bit about geology. I get to learn about biology. I get to learn about climate science. All of these things wrapped in under the umbrella of this one material. So I'm in the middle of that project now. It's been endlessly fascinating. It gets me talking to a whole group of people of a kind I really never got to talk to about before, which is people in the construction sector, which is very gratifying to me because my dad was an architect and I grew up going to construction sites throughout my whole youth.
When is
And
this
it
going to come
also,
out?
it lets me think about Indonesia in new ways
Yeah.
too. Because Indonesia now, infrastructure is such a key part of the aspirations of the nation.
Right. Well, I mean, China has been quite
China's incredible.
massive on this.
Well, between 2018 and 2021, I believe that's the 3-year period, China used more concrete
Yeah, the whole
than
century
the
in the
United
U.S.
States used in 150 years.
Well, 150. I thought it was 100 years. My gosh. Wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
That's crazy.
there's very little difference between 100 and 150 in concrete because more than 100 years ago they didn't use too much.
When is this thing likely to come out?
Well, I just signed the contract to do the book.
Okay.
So I don't know, I'm giving myself like a year, 18 months to do it.
Wow.
Actually, I misspoke. I'm not giving myself that time. The publishers has a sword over my head at that time.
Well, the very best of wishes
Thank you.
on this undertaking.
Thank you.
No, this is
And,
yeah. Sorry.
But there's
Go
a
ahead.
few other things I continue to look into and have written about. One of which is this period in Chicago history.
Yeah.
Near my house, which you've been to, there's a museum of Science and Industry, and the University of Chicago, and that's the site where in 1893 there was a giant World's Fair, probably still the biggest World's Fair that was ever held. And from the colonial East Indies came 165 people from West Java and Central Java to build a Javanese village right here in Chicago for the World's Fair. And this has been a topic that's endlessly fascinating to me. I want to explore it as much as I possibly can. Maybe some of your viewers can help me do this. The center of where people came from was both the Sultan's court in Solo and the area around Sukabumi and Parakan Saleh.
This was in the late 19th century, right?
Yeah, in the late 19th century. So these Dutch planters, the Dutch government didn't want to send people, but these Dutch planters got together mainly to sell tea, Indonesian tea in the United States. And they created this sensation. They brought all of the materials to build the village from Indonesia. They brought the Indonesians. They could play gamelan. They danced. They did wayang golek, wayang orang. And they brought a gamelan. They made handicrafts while they were here. They did batik. Surprisingly, to many people today, it was the most popular attraction in the entire World's Fair.
Wow.
The single most popular attraction at an American World's Fair at the end of the 19th century was an Indonesian village. And it was a sensation. It was the cover of every major magazine. Newspapers sent reporters just to cover it. People heard gamelan music when they were walking around the fair. So I've been researching this and I've written about it. If people go online and they put my name in Java Village, they'll find the article. So what happened then was, in the late 19th century, this was also the birth of the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, and so on. And the University of Chicago was just growing up at that time. So these early social scientists who were interested in other cultures had right in their back door a whole Indonesian village in which to kind of try things out. So it was right there, essential at the birth of the social sciences. And then at the end of the fair, there were 4,000 objects left over from this Java village in Chicago. And they became part of the foundational collection of the big Natural History Museum here, which is called the Field Museum. It's one of the 4 great natural history anthropology museums in the world. And the Java village was essential in its foundation.
Wow.
And if you go to the museum and you make an appointment, it's still possible to see some of these artifacts that are in storage, golden masks, statues of all kinds, puppets, everything that were here. And the museum still has that gamelan, which today is one of the oldest gamelans still playable in the world.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Not many Indonesians know about this.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
How do we get this re-electrified?
Well, I would love to, I've been talking for years with every consul general that comes here, with every Indonesian official I could collar who comes to Chicago, with all the museum officials, about recreating something like it, which would both fill the museum with all of these wonderful traditional practices from Indonesia, but also show Indonesia how it's cool today, what's up to date from Indonesia. Maybe somebody watching this will be interested in it. There's a lot of interest here in Chicago. It's really a matter of getting the funding, getting past COVID. As it happens, the director of exhibits at the Field Museum is half Indonesian. His mother is Indonesian, so he's interested in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Anyway, it could happen. It would be a really fantastic thing to see here again. I know you're interested in soft culture. And to me, it's always puzzling why some of the more popular art forms in Indonesia don't burst onto kind of the global culture market.
Yeah.
Although it's starting to happen with your help in film.
Yeah. Well, I've been involved in this for quite a bit, and it's like you said earlier. You wanna do something that you're gonna like for a long time. You wanna write something that you're gonna like. You're gonna write something that you wanna read, right? And that soft culture is something that I've been involved in, which ties to what you alluded to earlier. Because this is something that I like. I want to do something that I like, something I want to enjoy. I want other people to enjoy. And making movies, I think, has been different in telling the story of Indonesia or Indonesians to not just Indonesians, but to the rest of the world. Somewhat better than music, for some reason. I thought music
it has the story aspect to it.
Yeah.
Also, I really have enjoyed the films of yours that I've gotten to see because they are really strong on story. I've been over the last few days, I've been watching Keluarga Cemara. the film.
Well, they're not my
version of
films,
it.
but they're
It's
they're
not
made
your
by,
film. Some of the people you work with are attached to it, but it's not your film.
Yeah. I don't deserve to take credit as much as some of the other guys.
But for me, it's really fun because it goes. It's weird. It's kind of like it goes into the. It's a family that moves to the desa, and I get to see all those desa scenes. And everything.
But Ted, I want to push on this. I want to tease you and the audience about this idea that we've kind of talked about earlier. There's this notion that what happened in Indonesia about 75,000 years ago called the Toba volcanic eruption might have something to do with the cognitive revolution that took place 70,000 years ago. And you know, I've read quite a number of books on this that have described to the extent where the population of the world actually dwindled to only 2,000, 75,000 years ago, shortly after this happened in Toba. And this had so many repercussions, you know, geographically, culturally, ethnically, health-wise, you name it, right? And this just seems like something that I think the Indonesian people need to recognize a bit more, that there might be or there is a correlation between an event in Indonesia 75,000 years ago with how the cognitive ability of humanity improved starkly 70,000 years ago. Because the temperature drop by 6 to 13 degrees for thousands of years. It created thousands of years of winters to the point where only very few people could survive. And the survival instinct either reflected upon one's ability to think better, or it actually caused people to think better. Brain size got bigger. And you hear stories about how, you know, there are skeletons of the Java man found about 40, 50,000 years ago. Then there are stories about some remains of species found in Indonesia more than 100,000 years ago. And we could just deduce that, you know, by way of comparing what we found more than 100,000 years ago and what we found 40 to 50,000 years ago, there didn't seem to be a linear evolution, right, between the two events, to the point you can sort of like hypothesize that there was a disruption in those that were living in Indonesia. And this is, I don't know, it sounds like the kind of story that maybe Indonesians would like to not only write, but read about.
Well, I think it's a fantastic story. So, first of all, it's definitely worth a book or more.
Yeah. To be written by Ted
and-
Fishman.
No, I'm going to read it with your name under the title. But it, you know, why is it a good story? It's a good story because, first of all, it's an astounding event that's interesting in itself. You know, and you know, who knows? The world could always be threatened by a volcano of this magnitude. So, you know, we live under this threat at all times, although we may not know it. And, you know, the human being picking berries or catching fish at that time had no idea this was coming. They're no different than us. We have no idea whether it's coming. But it's also, but more fundamentally, Gita, tell me if this makes sense to you. It's a kind of Noah's Ark story.
Yeah.
Right. So in the Noah's Ark story, all of humanity is reduced to two humans, or maybe he had his kids on the ark, I'm not sure. And then two of every other animal. And the whole, you know, tree of life in this religious story grows out of, you know, this one catastrophe. And people tend to think that this was based on a real catastrophe, you know, big flooding that is also in the Gilgamesh epic and other things. Well, here's an event which, you know, you could say is several magnitudes bigger than what's described in our religious traditions. And, you know, out of that catastrophe comes a whole new mode of human existence.
Right.
You know, and Indonesia is the epicenter of this element. This is, Indonesia is the ark,
Yeah.
to say in a way, right?
Yeah.
Or Indonesia's the flood. I'm not sure whether in this story
No,
Indonesia's the ark.
I would rather think of it as the ark.
Yeah. Um, and it just puts the archipelago at the center of humanity. If you think of Africa as the cradle of humanity out of which the first humans came, and then this event comes and wipes out all but a very small population, then Indonesia is the place where humanity rebooted, right?
Right.
Um,
Cognitively.
and then if you could trace, as you said, as you've already done in this conversation, all of I think it'd be very interesting for, like, if I were to kind of structure it just off the top of my head, to kind of build a ladder of cognitive competence over time. Okay, after this is what happened. This is how people adjusted to the dark. This is how people adjusted to the cold. This is how skills happen. This is how we move from the no tool age to using tools to, through the different ages of humankind.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And this kind of book, there's always some kind of book like this on the bestseller list, something that says, where did we come from? Who are we? I mean, there's no more enticing a topic than who are we?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be just for an Indonesian audience. That's a book that
depends on how it's
Indonesian
written.
in one way.
Yeah.
What?
Depends on how it's written.
Yeah,
I think it could appeal to a broader audience. But this is something I've been pondering, for a bit. And this is,
well, it also, one thing that's really irresistible about this as a topic is that it combines real science with room for your imagination.
right. I mean, you
Right?
can
What
you
was
can
community like?
you can take a look at this from an anthropological angle, historical, of course, topographical, geographic, genetic, biological, physical, chemical, you name it, man, right?
It's all there.
Yeah.
It's all there. And there's probably experts all along the way who may or may not be talking to each other, but you could string them together.
Yeah. I was talking to a geneticist just a few days ago and started chatting about this. And it was like, ooh, yeah, this could make sense because, she has studied the genetic evolution of Indonesia and Indonesians.
And what did she learn?
It's not impossible. That's what she said. Because she's been working on the genetics of things as to prove that our ancestry is kind of like all mixed up, right? And it's kind of good because it justifies the notion that we shouldn't be worried about pribumi, non-pribumi. We shouldn't be worried about racial differentiation because, if we trace the DNA of all the sukus in Indonesia, all the way back thousands of years, there's commonality.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so, yeah, we just got to try to trace it back to 75,000 years ago. And there is, I think, well, not a deduction, but sort of a notion that I think there could have been a disruption. If we go back 76,000 years ago, whatever species that existed in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, or the broader Asia, wouldn't have anything to do with what had existed 40, 50,000 years ago. It wasn't that linear. So, whatever we found that would have existed 40, 50,000 years ago would have been a migration of species or creatures or things that would have come from a different direction, right?
Well, to me, this is an irresistible story.
Okay.
When I was in Taiwan, maybe some people watching this, there's a place you can go which is near the famous Taroko Gorge, which is a big canyon, and it's like a Kampung Adat, and it has the Aboriginal people of Taiwan, and there's a rock there with some inscription in their native language, and if you speak a Malay-based language, you can kind of figure out what's on the rock, right?
Yeah. Fascinating.
And you know, the dispersion of people from Indonesia and to Indonesia is so vast
Yeah.
that it would be really interesting to kind of take it back to year zero where everything reboots.
Yeah.
And how did it all get there?
Wow, that's
You know,
that's
it
encouraging.
turns the global narrative on its head, right?
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I want to switch topic, Ted. You've written
Yeah.
a book about China. You've written about a book about, you know, the shock of gray. You talked a lot about what was happening in Florida, you know, with those people that were aging and all that, right? So I want to put this in the context of, you know, the decoupling that's happening between the U.S. and China. And you know, some people are of the opinion that the Cold War has started between China and the U.S. But I'm sort of like in the camp that believes that I think if it were to be in a Cold War, if they were to be in a Cold War, I think it's going to stay cold for a long time. It's not going to get hot. Just from the sheer fact that the trade between the two countries is approximately around 700 billion US, right?
Yeah, it's huge.
When
Right.
we saw the end of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US in 1989, the collective trade between those two countries at that time would have been between 20 to 30 billion dollars, right? So it's just, I don't know, intuitively not easy to untangle $700 billion worth of, you know, collective economic activities, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Share your views, Ted, about what's happening and what you think will unravel going forward.
Well, I mean, this is definitely in the spirit of a conversation because I know your expertise on this is quite deep.
No, I mean just in any, you know, from any angle. Yeah.
So, from a big perspective, you know, if we were to imagine a different kind of China that had never engaged with the West or had never gone to a market economy, how dangerous would the world be now? We'd be dealing with an entity that was closer to North Korea, but with 1.4 billion people. And the world would be far more dangerous. You know, so at the most basic, we should be thankful for the status quo with China right now. Because, you know, the world has been diffused from what would be a much bigger danger. And not just a danger from China, but how would the United States react to a North Korea that had 1.5 billion, 4 billion people? The world, or Japan.
That'd be scary.
It'd be terrifying.
Yeah.
So if you kind of look at China rather, you know, the classic way of separating the views is, do you look at it as a snapshot right now and all of the problems now, or do you look at it as a movie? And as a movie, we're in a pretty good place. If you look at the snapshot, there's a lot of tension. And one thing I hear a lot from Indonesians is that many Indonesians are convinced that the United States is somehow in decline and that China is on the rise. I don't think the United States is in decline. I think just empirically, it's not. If you look at the news and CNN is your barometer for the United States, or Fox News is the barometer of the United States, you're looking at entities whose whole business it is to sell ads against convincing the world that there are problems.
Yeah, they're chasing clicks.
Yeah, chasing clicks. And so, of course, the most dramatic, the most tension-filled elements of American society are going to be broadcast to the rest of the world. If you see China from the point of view of Chinese media or how China disseminates its information, it is free of drama. There's no drama. You can't even, you'll never know the problems that are there. Here, you'll only know the problems. So just in terms of evaluating the world empirically, there's a problem with seeing it from the point of view of the sources that most of the world sees. United States has a far smaller population than China. We're still a big country, of course. But in terms of our economic power, it's still far greater than China on so many fronts. We have an enormously dynamic economy, a changing economy. We have an economy where whole industries can replace themselves in a matter of years with new industries. It's the envy of the world that way. Nobody says they want to build a new Chengdu. They say they want to build a new Silicon Valley. Or maybe even Silicon Valley's old hat now. And, when you think about it from the soft power point of view, I think China's still kind of a desert in soft power, except for the kind of economic pressure it could bring to bear on countries, or the largesse it could bring with loans and investment.
Right.
But you don't really turn on Indonesian radio and hear Chinese pop stars.
Yeah.
Even compared to South Korea or Japan, it has no presence in the mind share
Yeah.
of the world.
It's
and then
more,
when
it's
you
more
think about-
Snoop Dogg and, Dr. Dre and Mary J. Blige and
Yeah.
Ariana Grande.
Or look at Indonesian pop culture. There's several strains in which Indonesian pop culture is headed. One is kind of a more international mode with stand-up and comic films and things that play easily on Netflix.
Right.
And there's the more religious stuff that is influenced more by strains maybe from Turkey or the Middle East or the subcontinent. But pop culture is not coming from China, really.
It's coming more from Korea, actually.
Yeah, Korea Korea.
BTS.
Japan owned it. Korea owned it. Yeah,
It's crazy.
yeah. But you can't be a Korean-style boy band in China anymore because they don't want boys to look like that. It's like they'll just stop it. I just kind of feel in terms of like, what does the world want outside China? What image does the rest of Asia have of itself? I think the image the rest of Asia has of itself is, number one, be as true as possible you can to your own country, whether it's Indonesia, Korea, or Japan. And then second, kind of latch on to the cool strains of global culture, which aren't coming from China right now. I think the whole world's waiting for it to come from China because there's enormous creativity pent up in that country. And I'm just waiting for it to show up in the way that Japan and Korea have been able to do. Geopolitically, it seems like the United States is, China seems like, it talks really aggressively and it builds islands where it should or shouldn't build islands. The South China Sea is really contentious. But who's getting signed up for all these security agreements around the world? Japan, Indonesia, Thailand, and everything. There's coalition. These are multilateral coalitions that are building as bulwarks that are insurance against an aggressive China. And maybe insurance against an aggressive United States too, who knows?
Yeah.
But, you know, I think there is a kind of, this is one really troubling thing to me about some of the streams of thought that I hear among Indonesian elites, which is there's a kind of romance with dictatorship. You know, like they think America is coming apart because it's too democratic, because democracy has failed, and that China's really got it together. You know, look what China has done for itself. But is what China's done for itself better than what Korea has done for itself, or than Japan has done for itself, or Taiwan has done for itself with democracy? I don't know. You know, pick the future you want to live in.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, China started from a very low base. Its standard of living has gone up many-fold, which is absolutely admirable. It's rescued a lot of people from the most dire kinds of poverty, which you could argue Chinese culture created initially anyway. You know, but in terms of a model, as being a model for other countries in its governance, I think there'd be a lot of regret if that model were to quickly seize Indonesia or other more democratic places in Southeast Asia. You know, I kind of see, like you, I kind of see a future in which there's a lot more muddling through than a future where things are really decided in that way. And the muddling through kind of, it favors the gray zones.
Yeah.
I don't know, but you know, there are not, I don't want to say, Gita, that there aren't huge problems facing the US. There are huge problems.
Not just the US, but many democracies around the world.
Many democracies, but that's kind of the, you know, the democracies are under threat, right? So you don't want the democracies to go abroad. But when democracies just have problems, they're just proving that they're democracies.
Right.
Right? I mean, democracy is super messy.
Right.
It's super messy. You just have to make sure that it doesn't vote itself out of existence.
Yeah.
But, you know, isn't it a good thing that all of these issues are coming to the fore, that they're not swept under the carpet? You know, that race divides, ethnic divides, wealth divides, you know, geographical tensions. Isn't it a good thing that in the long run that they're being fleshed out?
Yeah. Interesting.
You know, that's us at work. The media, the issues around the media though are
I agree.
Are really intense. You know, I yesterday I was just so, I turned on the news. I turned on CNN. And first of all, CNN is just filled with advertisements for medicines that are for people my age and older. So it makes me feel really old. You know, these American ads, they always show you older people looking pretty fit, playing football, riding their bikes, doing everything. And then 80% of the ad is warnings on all the side effects these drugs have while they show you these beautiful pictures. And they just make you feel like 1,000 years old and that you're sick. So, and they're selling news against this. So the people watching these news stations are older people sitting in their chairs, coughing, looking at the world falling apart.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm really hungry for just a news source that that's not driven by, you know, these commercial impulses that have to have these hooks every 20 seconds. It's depressing. So getting back to your question about books, you know, one of the virtues of books is that they sell on the virtue of their ideas, not on the virtue of the ads.
Well, I think this is going to take us to the last part of our conversation where we talk about the future, right? And I usually end up asking about where Indonesia is going to end up in 2045, which is about 22, 23 years from today, right? And I agree with you in that, the media have not played enough of a role in democratizing ideas, right? They've I think, played a much bigger role in polarizing ideas. And I think people deserve to enjoy the whole spectrum as opposed to just two poles of the spectrum. And I do envision a future of Indonesia where every Indonesian gets to enjoy the whole spectrum of ideas, right? Let's take it from there, Ted. How do you see, and what do you see as some of the things that Indonesians or Indonesia need to do to achieve a good future in 2045?
Well, first of all, you're deeply involved in the project of creating the country's best public policy school. And I assume
Inshallah.
when we talk, it's happening. It's happening. I assume when people come to study public policy with you and your colleagues, you're not teaching them how to propagandize. No. You're not teaching them how to tilt the facts. You're not teaching them to mislead the public. You're teaching them how to deliver the best goods and services to the people of Indonesia using the best empirical tools available and persuading people around those. And I think one of the things that is missing from political discussion in the United States, and it's often absent from political discussion in Indonesia, is who are the candidates, who are the leaders who we will celebrate for their intelligence and their competence, rather than for the power of their personality, their ideology, their fame, their wealth, and so on. And this might just be part of the pendulum of democracy, where you move from a period where people are really defending their own to when they have a deeper sense of the public. And what is the public, and what's in the public interest, and are we citizens of the same entity? Both of our countries have these mottos, from many, one. But I think both of our countries are also in this mode where we're kind of from one, many. And it has to swing the other way. And I think the way that happens is when you get the competent people to stand up and say, this is what's important to the public. Yeah. What's important is we're making people healthier, happier, richer, kinder, and more satisfied in their community from a sense of community, rather than the things you can do in your own home against the people who are your neighbors. And one of the things I really love about my time in Indonesia and among Indonesians is that when you get down to the local level, there is no place where there's a stronger sense of community than an Indonesian community. I mean, I think Indonesians really feel it and they want it. And I learned it. I learned it there, gotong royong.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, it's a kind of gift that's always there in Indonesia. Yeah. But as you get further and further and the geographies grow and grow, then the divisions. But look, Indonesia's defied the world's expectations for decades. Oh, yeah. When the rest of the world expected it to break up into 100 different countries. Yeah. And Indonesians like being one country. And it's still relatively new democracy. I think Indonesia in 2045 will just be much more sophisticated about governance. It it's still hammering out what kind of structures, what level of local democracy, national democracy,
Yeah.
who should be appointed, who should be elected, all of that stuff. I think those issues will probably be further resolved and there'll be stability on that front. The United States went through all of those stages and we still do. But I mean, those are things that tend to get resolved over time. I think in terms of governance and, the quality of institutions, Indonesia is about at the place where young democracies are at.
Right. I take comfort in the fact that some of the imperfections that we're witnessing anywhere in any democracy are actually non-permanent. They're not parts of the laws of physics, right?
Absolutely
So the
not.
non-permanence of some of these imperfections gives me optimism. And I do believe that the young generations of Indonesia or Indonesians, I think they will have that necessary intuition to move in the right direction. Taking a
And
long view.
expertise. And
Yeah.
expertise.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
There's your school. I'm here in the shadow of the University of Chicago and Northwestern University. Every year there's more Indonesians there studying economics, public policy, sciences, computer science, everything. And, so the intellectual capital of the country can, only go up.
Yeah.
The brilliance is already there. It's
Yeah.
it's just, having the chance to identify it. And look, Indonesia is, even despite COVID and everything, it can still be and is, the envy of many other places in the world.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful place to live.
Yeah.
And spend time, and when I'm not there, I miss it. And, the big challenges for Indonesia in 2045 are the global challenges. Nobody needs me to say it, but climate is a huge issue.
Oh. Yeah.
Indonesia faces its own particular threats because of climate change, and the news never gets better. The news on climate never gets better; it only gets worse.
Yeah.
So Indonesia will need the best institutions, the biggest sense of public purpose in order to have the resilience to manage the challenges that are coming with climate change.
I agree. Wow.
then-
Okay.
I would say one more thing, which is related to your China question, which is, there was this book a while ago, and I think it was mostly the United States was the target of the book, an Indonesia that can say no. Right? I think every country has somebody who writes the book about our country can say no. And for most of the post-World War II period, it meant saying no to the United States. Right? And, people can still say no to the United States because we are a democracy. But the ability of ASEAN countries to say no to China is maybe getting harder.
Yeah. There is some degree of co-optation.
Yeah. And, I think, what's, it's a big question on what direction it'll go in. There'll either be a strong counter reaction to that. Indonesia's history is to assert its own independence. It's the founder of the non-aligned movement.
Yeah.
It's just, how is that going to rear its head? Is it going to come through the political, the standard nationalist political conversation? Is it going to come from a religious quarter? Is the fact that China has imprisoned 3 million Muslims going to be a political issue in Indonesia? Those are all things that will play out
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we all have our bugaboos. China's got the Uyghur issue. The United States is a big supporter of Israel.
Nobody's perfect.
Yeah. So.
But you know, it's important to coalesce.
Yeah.
Right? To collaborate. So I think whoever is going to be able to collaborate more and better and faster is going to stand out.
Yeah.
And whoever is going to alienate, you know, himself or herself from the others faster, more, and worse is less likely to stand out. So,
you know, I thought one of the really great Endgame interviews you did was with Pat Marty, talking about ASEAN.
Yeah, he's a dear friend. Oh my.
You know, and he really, you know, despite all of the ways people badmouth ASEAN, China in particular, you know, he's a real optimist on the ability to find common ground.
Oh, he's a true believer of the centrality of ASEAN, and that's what's going to carry us a long way. Yes, we've gone through some episodes where centrality has been somewhat challenged or questioned, but I think we're gonna, you know, pull through. And he's in that camp.
Yeah.
So, you know, whatever you've been talking about, whatever I've been talking about, I think it's episodic, right? And I think you're right, the pendulum is going to swing. Question is time frame, when, right?
Right. And the world does have these things where you just don't have all the time in the world.
Yeah.
Like you don't have all the time in the world on climate.
Yeah. Anyway, Ted, any final messages for us?
Well, you know, when you're talking about the world's concerns, it's natural to sound concerned. But when it comes to Indonesia, you know, I think there's every reason to be optimistic. You know, so I'm engaged with Indonesians almost every day of my life.
Yeah.
I engage with them socially, intellectually, and in other ways, artistically.
Culinarily, culturally.
And, you know, every time I come back to thinking about Indonesia, you know, it's just, it's like thinking about a treasure chest, you know.
Yeah.
For me, my relationship with the country is one of the treasures of my life. Yeah. I'm really optimistic about the country's future. I've seen the genius of Indonesians up close. I feed off the genius of Indonesians. You know, there's a lot of places in the world to be deeply, deeply pessimistic.
Yeah, I agree.
There aren't a lot of places to be optimistic, but Indonesia really is a place.
It's one of the few. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ted.
Oh, my pleasure.
For being a friend of Indonesia.
I'm so grateful, though.
All right. Enjoy the snow.
Thank you. It's going to be, there's no snow today. It's an ice storm, I'm afraid.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Gita.
Teman-teman, itulah teman dekat kita, Ted Fishman, penulis terkenal. Terima kasih. Inilah Endgame.